So thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. And we're going to get started here in just a minute. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to our second day of our workshop on non-traditional security challenges in South Asia, improving disaster management cooperation. For those of you joining us today, we had what I felt was an excellent discussion yesterday, set up by some very insightful comments from both the Consul General, Judith Ravin, and the Commissioner for the Greater Chennai Corporation, Mr. Gagandeep Singh Bedi. Our response panel highlighted the importance of speed, communication, and adaptability of relief efforts immediately following disasters. And our recovery panel emphasized the importance of working with local partners in order to truly build back better. To start us off on this second day of the workshop, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator, Ambassador Tariq Karim of the Independent University of Bangladesh. Ambassador Karim's career spans many years and many sectors, and his full biography is included in today's agenda and speaker bios. So to get us started on our discussion of disaster mitigation, I'd like to hand things over to Ambassador Tariq Karim. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm unmuted, I think, and you can see me. Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are to everyone, and welcome to this panel session. Thank you, NBR and Tom and the organizers of this Chennai workshop for giving me the privilege and the honor of moderating this particular panel. I followed the discussion so far, and I think the point I take is, the takeaway point is that people are more aware, at least, of the dangers that they face and that they need to do something. Whether we'll finally get around to putting all our efforts together and doing something is another matter, but the efforts must continue. And I'm telling you this because I've been fighting this fight for the last 25 plus years. It's very, very difficult to change mindsets. And the only way to change changing mindsets can take a couple of generations. So you just have to stay engaged and keep working away at it. This panel deals with mitigation. And as such, it takes the broader and the long-term view in mind. It has to be strategic in its view. It requires addressing governance issues. That is at the heart. And in fact, the problems are at this heart, which most tend to ignore. Policymakers need to engage in anticipatory thinking. But 99% of the time, because they have so many other issues to contend with at the same time, they are reactive. It's only when disaster is upon you that they say, okay, we have to scramble and deal with this disaster. You shove something else to the side and you deal with this particular disaster. And then life goes on as normal. They also have to be informed in the policy making. In other words, they have to have knowledge. And that's a short-sightedness, I think, which is universal. Maybe a handful of exceptional policymakers will really delve deeply into a subject and think things out before recommending actions to be taken. So it falls on people like all of you here. And I was a policymaker for a long time, and I know what it means to be dealing with issues in the dark. It's for people like you with vast knowledge and experience to bring their voices up to the front and say, this is how reality is on the ground, and this is how you need to address it. Mostly policymaking is done in a sort of void. It is it appears that it is not related to reality or the communities who have to be affected by it. Governance issues will require regulatory measures. But okay, we have a plethora of regulatory measures in place. The test of a good regulatory measure or the test of a government's ability is it monitoring the regulatory efforts that have been put in place, how it is being executed? Is it being flouted? If it is being flouted, are there punitive measures corrective measures taken against it? And these are there in many countries. I've seen this. This is there in the US. It's there in many of the European countries. Unfortunately, South Asia is a region in which the world seems to have passed us by. And I will just recall here that over a decade ago, NBR had hosted a 3-year workshop on non-traditional security dealing precisely with what we are dealing with now. It was dealing with the macro picture then, ecological and environmental security and how it will affect South Asian region in 2025. Now, mind you, we are talking about 2025 in the futures exercise in 2010 and 2011 and 2012. And I had advocated then that, okay, if we take the data and the facts on the ground that they exist today in 2010 or then, if you extrapolate it to 2025, this is what the population will be. This is how the magnitude of the storms will be. This is, etc. I mean, and drawing upon reports from the IPCC and others. And it was very clear. There were a couple of very senior scientists who were also on that panel. It was very clear where we were headed. So unless we got our acts together, we were not going to be able to address it. And most of them were non-traditional issues dealing with not just economic security, but with food security, environment security, ecological security, and wildcard events in which, believe it or not, we even mentioned the possibility of a pandemic hitting us. Now, I advocated at that time that South Asians need to get together and put a regulatory body, not just an association like SARC, it needs an authority. Now, for an authority, here we come to the crux of the problem. And you will see how it's basically the mindset is at the national and subnational level, which permeates and hits the transnational level, in the regional level. Global is a universe away from us. Okay. And some of the things that came out, I mean, for example, you need to stop turf battles. And I'm speaking at the very ground level. You have turf battles all the time. You have turf battles between center and state. You have turf battles between one union and another, one municipality and another, who's going to get what resources and where. All these are going all the time. But we have turf battles even in the national governance spheres, where ministries, where an item which has to be considered holistically, having several components hitting it, are dealt with in silos by different ministries who do not talk to each other, who do not share the information. And if we can't do that there, you have in India, you have the federal, center and state problem. In the subcontinent, we have problems between nations. Now, fine, we can in a cartographic map or delineation of space, we can say this territory is mine, you govern it, this is mine, I govern it. But how do you govern commons? Can you really draw Westphalian lines across the hydrosphere or the atmosphere? And we are now beginning to realize that they do not respect man-made laws. We have to adapt to their laws, to natural laws, conform to it, and then learn how to work with how nature works before we can get on top of this. So I will stop my rambling here. I just thought I'd flag these few points that I have learned from my experience. We're still eons away, it seems, although I'm still trying my best to see if we can knock heads to get regional cooperation going. It still seems a distant dream to me. World now seems to be even more fragmented than it was 75 years ago, or even 40 years ago. So I will, without saying anything further, uh, I, I think the broad guiding questions that have already been laid out to all the panelists, and we have two very distinguished panelists here. Their bios have been circulated, so you have access to them. So I'll call on the first panelist, Deepa Srinivasan, to commence with her remarks. And Deepa, you have 12 minutes.
Great.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Good morning to everybody in the United States and good evening to those in South Asia. And thank you, Professor Karim and NBR and also the U.S. Consulate of Chennai for pulling this together. My name is Deepa Srinivasan, and I am president of Vision Planning and Consulting, and we are a firm located out of suburban DC that's been in business in the disaster management business for about 15 years. About a couple of years ago, I decided to, I'm originally from Bangalore, India, where I did my bachelor's before I moved to the United States several years ago. And a couple of years ago, I decided to sort of, do my version of giving back to India. And I said, okay, I want to be able to take what I've learned in the United States, apply it in India. So I opened up an office there. And I have it's been a slow upward trajectory, throwing the major pandemic in a couple months after I opened up. So I want to kind of share, mitigation is a very, very broad topic. And I want to share sort of my observances and sort of lay out some comparisons between the work we do in the United States and what I see in South Asia, particularly, primarily in India. Next slide, please. Okay, so our goal is to ultimately, wherever we're doing it, regardless of continent, is to develop products for preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery to ultimately reduce risk, protect people, secure physical assets, and improve economic well-being. The goal of this presentation is sort of look at these four components of emergency preparedness and see how they all come together, and the importance of looking at it cohesively and yet dealing with it separately. Next slide, please. So as we all know, we're looking at the four phases of emergency management, where mitigation is sort of the long-term preparedness before a disaster. Preparedness is more short-term, weeks or days even before a disaster. The disaster strikes, you have a major event, and then you have immediate response within 24, 48, 72 hours. And then there's long-term recovery, which goes into years of building back and building back better. Next slide, please. So in these four phases, there are very, very distinct plans that need to be developed. And I will be talking from a planning standpoint, not necessarily from an implementation standpoint. And the importance of developing these plans that talk to one another in the different phases, but also are very discrete in what they do. So if you're looking at preparedness, it's looking at identifying threats, identifying specific hazards, developing a risk assessment to address vulnerabilities of population, of structures, of people within those areas. Also looking at a continuity of operations plan, and then finally training folks for when a disaster strikes. When you look at the mitigation side of it, it's developing hazard mitigation plans at various levels of government, whether it's at the district level, at the county level, at the state level, developing these hazard mitigation plans, looking at integration guides where all of the plans that are not related to emergency management are talking. For example, a transportation plan, or an economic development plan, or a housing plan, and how that ties in under the mitigation. So if you look at mitigation as an umbrella, you're looking at all of these components that come in with the umbrella of safety under it. So that would be sort of what would fall under mitigation. in the United States, there's also a big push for what we call resilient university plans, which are DRU plans, where we believe that the current mitigation plans at the local level are not given the importance to universities because they are sort of an autonomous body. So we focus on developing plans for just universities at the building level, at the student level, to make sure that the campus itself is sort of mitigated against various disasters. And these plans are related very closely to the county plan and the state plan. So then we come to response plans. These are specific functional plans. Also, we look at lessons learned from a particular disaster. Right after you develop your after action reports, what is right, what is wrong, what could be done better for this particular disaster, what has been done for a previous disaster, or what has been done for this disaster in your neighboring county. We also look at emergency operations plans of running the actual levels of government, the actual departments, who does what before, during, and after a disaster, and how interdepartmental coordination is key, whether it's horizontal integration between departments or vertical between district and state, or county and state, and what have you. And then we also look at continuity of operations plans, which is what happens to reduce the interruption once a disaster strikes? What is your response time? What is your recovery time objective? We call them RTOs. For every little function, you develop an RTO, whether it's 6 hours after a disaster that you have to be up and running, or 24 hours, or 48 hours. So very, very targeted plans for each of these different elements. And then finally, we get into the recovery aspect, which is long-term recovery plans, building back better your housing, your business, your economic development, your transportation networks, your infrastructure. You do a needs assessment, and then you identify recovery support function frameworks on how all of these recovery support functions work together in tandem to build back a whole community. So as you can tell, there's a variety of different plans, very, very specific to what the target audience is, what needs to be done. So at any given time, you pick up a particular plan and run with it. Next slide, please. So just like the different plans, there are specific actions that are targeted to the various phases of emergency management. In mitigation, you're looking at long-term structural solutions, non-structural solutions. If you're looking at preparedness, you're looking at training personnel in hazard and threat emergency procedures, maintaining updated personnel call-in lists, vacation schedules. If you're looking at response, you're looking at canceling non-essential activities, projects as necessary, deploying people and materials to specific sites, maintaining records. And then if you're looking at recovery, you're looking at, again, assessing damages and with the goal of building back better. And I'm doing this in 4 categories because it's really important, while looking at it holistically under disaster management, to look at it separately. And my observation in working in South Asia is sort of that I'm starting to see that there is a combined effort of sorts where there is a tendency to put everything into one plan and without giving it the importance it needs, because like I said, each of these plans are very targeted for what they're recommending. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you 2 different examples. So let's talk about what is it an emergency plan. Basically, you're looking at the various hazards. You're looking at the concept of operations, how a local government actually functions, specific roles and responsibilities within government and even within a department, from the director to the assistant director to the people who actually, the worker bees, specific roles and responsibilities. And then we also look at various phases of the comprehensive emergency management cycle, like I mentioned, administration and logistics, maintenance, distribution, and then specific emergencies, ESFs, specific functions, for example, communications, transportation, safety. These are specific functions. And then you also look at specific hazards and how these functions tie in with specific hazards. So if I'm a department head, I might be doing slightly different things, whether it's if it's an earthquake versus a tornado versus a pandemic. So what are our specific functions? So emergency operations is the current operations on a day-to-day basis. On the next slide, please. So in comparison, let's look at what is in a hazard mitigation plan, which is the long-term preparedness phase of it. We're looking at a community profile, the geography, the climate. We're looking at every single hazard, where its location, what the magnitude is, what past occurrences have been, what the damage has been caused, the cost of damage, the number of lives lost, the number of crop damage, and then we're also looking at the probability of future events to predict, what the cost might be, what vulnerable areas are. And then we look at the vulnerabilities, again, the cost estimate, and look at an inventory of assets, whether it's housing or infrastructure or institutional buildings, look at the inventory. And then finally, you do a capability assessment of here's all the vulnerability, here's the risk, here are the hazards, what are our capabilities, which department has what, to identify the gaps. And then we do a detailed mitigation action plan where you identify specific actions, a lead agency, the timeline, the cost, the funding sources. And I want to say this because I'm comparing an EOP from the previous slide to what's in a hazard mitigation plan, just to give you a clear idea of how different the two plans are. And I bring this up because recently we developed what's called a district management plan, and we were asked to throw an EOP in. And I said, that is a completely different product and project in and of itself. So it's important to understand where one ends and where the next one begins. Next slide, please. So again, really quickly looking at some hazard types, we just talked about a hazard mitigation plan. So, that where we're looking at vulnerability analysis, we're looking at the vulnerability of every single hazard, different natural hazards versus technological hazards versus man-made hazards. And now we're dealing with multiple layers of hazards. Recently we had Hurricane Ira, which hit New York last weekend. And, we had flooding. It was a hurricane. It's burned tornadoes in New Jersey, and we're living in a pandemic. So if you're talking about 3 or 4 hazards, natural, technological, man-made, and a combination of these. So we're starting to look at more hazards than one going forward worldwide. Next slide, please.
You have 2 minutes more.
So these are just some common examples of mitigation projects. I won't get into the thing where some of them are local plans and regulations, some of them are infrastructure projects, some of them are natural resources type projects, and then the others are outreach and educational type projects. So you want to, at any given time, have a combination of all of these projects. Go ahead, next slide. So this is a cultural hazard mitigation plan where it looks at specific historic and cultural structures and looks at the architectural part built on building type, architectural features, and develop actions to actually keep the architectural characteristics, but still make sure that it can be mitigated for various risks. Next slide. So this here is a hazard mitigation crosswalk where the federal government were asked to submit plans to the federal government, and they review the plan in light of a crosswalk to make sure that every single item in a mitigation plan is sort of recorded and done the way it should be. I won't get into too much detail because of the time constraint. Next slide, please. So FEMA has developed this BRIC program where 6% of total disaster money is put towards mitigation. And these are the guiding principles. Next slide, please. So the principles is based on various FEMA lifelines, and these are based on incident management, and you're tying it to mitigation to make sure that at any given time you're able to recover with minimal downtime and get a community to be up and running. So these are sort of like a basic thing of the various FEMA lifelines. Next slide, please. Again, more FEMA lifelines. Okay, so this here ties in, it comes full circle, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. These are just some examples of some of the projects we've done. Here's a product on preparedness for Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. This is a state hazard mitigation plan that we recently completed for the state of Maryland. This is on the mitigation side. Next slide, please. This is a COVID response plan for the District of Columbia. This was done last year, it was a 13-month timeline. And the last slide. Finally, disaster recovery supports functions for FEMA. So I'm bringing up these examples to show you the various plans under the 4 components of disaster management. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deepa. It was very informative, very, very detailed, considering the time constraints. You brought out a number of factors, and I hope and wish that we in South Asia, individually and collectively, could start adopting something close to this. Some of us have, some of us are way away. Even within the country, we do not have that level of coordination that you're talking about. So you're presupposing something that doesn't exist. Our challenge is, how do we get to that ideal? I'll now call on Push Bajaj, Dr. Push Bajaj. Again, his bio is there, his specialty is known. Looking forward to your interesting remarks. Over to you, Push. 12 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. I will be talking about incorporating climate change and disaster management strategies. Before I begin, I would like to thank all the organizers at the NBR for giving me the opportunity to share my views, not only at this final workshop, but also during the discussion group sessions that we had earlier. And also thank you to the chair for those very interesting opening remarks. Next slide, please. So to give you a brief overview of this brief presentation, I will be talking about how climate change is changing the frequency, intensity, and predictability of extreme weather events. I will also be talking about how we need to be expecting the unexpected because of the new categories of extreme weather events that are now showing up all around the world. Then I'll be talking about some slow-moving, irreversible disasters, primarily sea level rise and some other examples of slow-moving disasters, which we now need to take into account because of climate change. And then finally, why we need a holistic and dynamic approach to disaster management. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that all of you are aware, and you've heard many times that extreme weather events are becoming more intense and more frequent because of climate change. But I think that it's worth to spend just a couple of minutes, and because this slide really helps to internalize what it actually means. So these graphs here are showing the distribution of temperature anomalies over the northern hemisphere for the period of June, July, August. Now, the time period and the location does not really matter because wherever you are, whatever period of the year, the distribution will look similar. So if you look at the extreme left-hand side, that is looking at the temperature distribution for the period of 1951 to 1980, so in a past climate. And you can see that the 0 corresponds to the average temperature. Because it's the average temperature, it's also the highest in probability. And as we go to higher or lower temperatures, the probability of those temperatures decreases. So it gives us like this bell-shaped format. Next, please. So in this type of a distribution, when we talk about extreme weather events, we are talking about these low probability, high temperature events that are the extreme events. Now, what is happening because of climate change is that the average temperature is now shifting to higher temperatures. And as the average temperature shifts, the entire distribution shifts along with it. So if you look at the middle panel, which is corresponding to the 1990 to 2000 period, you can see that the average temperature has shifted and the entire distribution has shifted with it. Next, please. So in this new distribution now, what we used to call extreme weather events previously are now not so much low probability. They have a significant probability of occurrence. And if we go to the last decade, which is the period of 2009 to 2019, which is in the extreme right-hand side, you can see that now the average temperature has shifted by quite a lot and the entire distribution has shifted by quite a lot. Next, please. So in this new distribution now, what used to be extreme events are no longer extreme low probability events. They're very much part of the distribution. And what else is happening? Next slide, please. What else is happening is that now we are seeing these new extreme events, which are much higher in temperature and they previously did not even exist in the distribution. So to sum up, next please. And one more click. So to sum up, the distribution of weather parameters is shifting. What used to be extreme low probability events are now becoming more common. And the extremes that previously did not even exist in the distribution are now showing up as the extreme rare events. Next slide, please. And this actually came out very nicely in the most recent contribution of the Working Group 1 to the IPCC sixth assessment report. They showed this very nicely and in an easy to understand manner. So this pictograph kind of here is showing that in the past pre-industrial climate for the period of 1850 to 1900, what used to be a 1 in 10 year event, in the current climate, now it is almost 3 times as likely to occur. And if we go to higher levels of global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees to 4 degrees Celsius, the probability of these events are expected to increase even further. And at 4 degrees Celsius, what used to be a hot temperature extreme, 1 in 10 year event, would now be 10 times more likely, or it would actually be an annual event. Next, please. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, the intensity is also increasing. And we can, we can look at that through climate models, and we can see that at growing levels of global warming, the hotness of these hot extremes is also going to be increasing. Now, when I say, when people say 1 in 10 year event, it does not actually mean that it's going to be an event that happens every 10 years, but it's saying that that in any given year, the probability of that event occurring is 1 in 10 or 1 in 500, 1 in 1000, and so on. Next slide, please. Now, what else happens because of rising temperatures? As the temperature increases, the ability of the atmosphere to hold vapor increases. In fact, with every 1 degree rise of temperature, there is a 7% increase in the ability of the atmosphere to hold water vapor. And the consequence of that is now we are seeing more dry periods. We are seeing more droughts because the atmosphere can now hold more water vapor. So this graph is showing the same thing as we saw earlier, but now for droughts. Also for droughts, the frequency and intensity of drought periods is expected to increase as we go to higher levels of global warming. Next slide, please. The corollary to this is that as the ability of the atmosphere to hold water vapor increases, it also rains more heavily when it rains. So the heavy precipitation events are also expected to increase as we go to higher levels of global warming. Next slide, please. Now, talking about what I said in the beginning, expecting the unexpected, because now there are new types of extreme events that are showing up. And a very good example of this, next slide, please, is the June 2021 heat wave that happened just recently in the Pacific Northwest, where we saw record-breaking temperatures in the Western United States. And this was a seemingly impossible weather event. And preliminary analysis have shown that without global warming, this event would have been a 1 in 150,000 year event, which is basically saying that the probability would be 1 over 150,000, which is nearly impossible. And the analysis also showed that because of global warming at the level that we are at right now, this event was made 150 times more likely. And the likelihood of such an event is only going to increase as we go to higher levels of global warming. Next slide, please. Giving some more examples of these unexpected events. Could you do 2 more clicks? So the traditionally calm Arabian Sea, talking about the Indian Ocean region, witnessed 4 powerful cyclones 4 years in a row in the past 4 years. And in 2021, the extremely severe cyclonic storm Tauktae affected several states of Kerala, Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. In fact, it was one of the deadliest cyclones, and it killed over 104 people. Now, this has been the Arabian Sea has been traditionally not known for having such extreme cyclones, and clearly the Western states are not prepared for such frequency and intensity of cyclonic storms. Another important point here is that the historically robust Indian monsoon season, which supplies nearly 70% of the annual rainfall in India, is expected to become more intense and less reliable in the near future. So both the number of extreme rainfall days and the number of dry spells are expected to increase in the future. Next slide, please. Now coming to my next point, which was about slow-moving irreversible disasters. The prime example for this is rising sea level. I will not spend too much time on this in the interest of time, but we can come back to this during the discussion part. But this is again taken from the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, which came out recently. This graph is showing the projections up to the year 2100. Next, please. So here, according to this SSP 8.5 to 8.5 scenario, the expected sea level rise is somewhere in the range of around 0.8 meters. But this scary looking kind of dashed line here is also something that the IPCC put out, which is the low likelihood, high impact storyline, which includes some ice sheet instability processes, which we are not so confident about just yet. So, to be honest, I think that low likelihood is just a euphemism for we don't know. We don't know how likely this is to happen, but it's definitely one of the possibilities that can happen. And this one shows, next slide, please. And this one shows an expected sea level rise of up to 2 meters in the worst case scenario by the year 2100. And I don't think I have to elaborate on the level of consequences that will follow with such a level of sea level rise. Next slide, please. So now moving on to my final couple of slides, why we need a holistic and dynamic approach to look at disaster management strategies. Not all disasters have a climate component, but those that do need to be viewed through the climate lens. Next, please. If you could do like 2 more clicks, three, one more. Yes, so climate change must influence all 4 aspects of disaster management: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and response. In fact, climate change mitigation itself becomes an integral part of disaster prevention and mitigation plans. And enhancing future climate resilience becomes a part of the preparedness strategies. Response plans, including long-term recovery plans, should consider security and sustainability against future climate change, which would be highly dynamic. Now, just to give you an example of what this process would look like, can we go to the next slide?
You can wind up in about a minute.
Absolutely, sir. Yeah, I'm almost done. So in this, mitigation, talking about mitigation, it needs to be an iterative process because of climate change. So when we start with identifying current vulnerability and future risks, then we move on to analyzing, evaluating, and prioritizing those risks, because those risks depend on the region and the geographical location, the risk profile, and all of that. So we need to prioritize those risks. Following that, we need to identify and prioritize adaptation measures. After that comes the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation section. But then you have to go back. You have to go back periodically and relook at this strategy, because like Ambassador Karim was saying earlier, that a lot has changed since we last discussed this in 2010 or whenever. And every 5 years, every 10 years, this is going to change. So that dynamic nature of climate change has to be taken into account. Next slide, please. Can you do 3 clicks? Yes. So some of these slow-moving disasters, such as sea level rise and other changes in the ocean environment, these changes will have consequences across borders. So we need to have regional and global cooperation in this area to look at disaster management strategy in a more holistic manner. The Indian Navy is, of course, the primary responder in the Indian Ocean region. Indian Navy, along with the other navies in the region, must prepare for the growing instances of HADR operations. The region must simultaneously increase the collective scientific and technological capacity to record, map, and predict these changes to better inform mitigation and adaptation strategies. Next slide, please. I come to an end to my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Bajaj. Very, very interesting. Not only interesting, it actually confirms what we anticipated way back in 2010. And when we anticipated that for 2025, it's already happening now a few years before 2025. And sitting here in Bangladesh over the last few years, I've seen how very real this scenario is. So as you mentioned, we have to have a dynamic approach. I totally agree. We have to constantly monitor, but most importantly, everyone from the ground level up to the highest policy-making level, they have to engage in anticipatory thinking. what the IPCC pointed out as low possibility. You don't know. It could become a very high possibility without you anticipating it, because some wild card will come and trigger off something else which will come and hit other things. And that, unfortunately, is what escapes most of us when we go into serious policy making. Thank you very much for a very, very informative. I'll throw the floor open now. And I cannot see everyone, so I'll just have to scroll and see, unless I can see the full screen. But someone monitoring, please tell me if I'm missing somebody. I have not yet seen a raised hand, but feel free to raise a hand or just unmute and say you want to speak, so I'll recognize you. Okay, I see a raised hand by Sarabjit Parmar.
Thank you, Ambassador. My question is to Deepa. Whenever we have a plan in place like you have described for various counties and cities, I think experience has taught us that we need to have an alternate base of operations. So in all the plans which have been specified by you, is there any provision for an alternate base of operations? For example, let's take the case of, say, Washington, D.C. Let's say Washington, D.C., God forbid, gets hit by an earthquake. The ability of the departments, as you have mentioned, to start working or working it out become an issue. So therefore, there is a need to cross-pollinate these plans onto neighboring cities or even counties or states. And that's something I think all the nations should look at to ensure that the response at least starts off immediately. And yesterday it was mobility. So is that something that has been factored? And in fact, even in our own, I'm not sure what NDMA has done, but I am aware that they do have certain provisions for on-site and even, say, mobile command centers, if you'd like to call it that. So your comments on this.
Yes, absolutely. Here in the United States, based on the concept of operations and it's called continuity of government. It's called coup planning, where you do have not just secondary, but you also have a tertiary. So the secondary and tertiary are sort of in an isolated location, at least like 20 miles away, sometimes in the same county, sometimes in a neighboring county. So these are units, there are mobile, but these are actually units on the ground that are up and running with computer systems, with personnel, and there are designated staff who are aligned to either going into work or working remotely, depending on what the type of work they do. So all that is listed in the continuity of operations plan. So really you can be up and running in as little as 4 hours. There's also what we call interdepartmental and intergovernmental agreements, where you have other counties that come to your county depending on the level of disaster. So there are systems in place at the very, very lowest level of government and going up all the way to the state to maintain continuity of operations. That is one of the main focuses of a continuity of operations time plan. It's called an RTO. It's called a recovery time objective. And so how long does it take when something happens and your main EOC is shut down? And it doesn't have to be a major hazard. It can even be a bomb threat. So there is these isolated locations, and when we develop these plans, we actually go visit those locations to identify what the infrastructure is, because these locations may never be used for as long as 10 years. So systems need to be updated, furniture needs to be updated. So all of that is taken into consideration into a continuity of operations plan.
That also involves some more budgeting and extra money, which
of course.
Yeah,
of
that's
course.
true.
Sorry, please go. That's where you run into the problems of political economy, where politics and economy intersects. And that's always a headache for everyone, particularly in less endowed countries.
Well, I will tell you that, yes, and that is sort of the dichotomy I have between, the work I do in Asia and the work I do here. Just to give you an example, FEMA's sort of mantra is for every $6 they spend in pre-disaster planning, for every dollar they spend in pre-disaster planning, they save $6 post-disaster. So it's a 1 in 6 ratio, which is why a lot of emphasis is given on planning prior to a disaster. And I find that in South Asia, there is a budget issue, a huge budget issue, but a lot of importance is given on the response side. So without being prepared, you're going to spend way more in response. And without being prepared, you are not prepared to respond. So if you kind of look, it sounds, it's self-intuitive in a way. So I think there has to be a dynamic shift in, there's got to be money upfront to prepare, so you spend less money beyond. You're not even talking about lives lost. You're just talking about before and after from a structural standpoint. So yeah, that is, I think we have some, years to go before we get to that point in parts of Asia.
Thank you.
If I could take my prerogative, Deepa, what would be the 3 most important things that you have mentioned in all your to-do things that you've listed that need to be addressed? What are the 3 most that we all need to, that's at the heart of everything else. If you don't get that done, nothing else will happen.
The first one is to sort of understand the importance of planning. Too many people put it off and say, let's just do things on the recovery side without having a plan in place. I cannot emphasize the importance of having a plan. The second one is, like I said, to differentiate plans. Do not put everything into one document, because ultimately you want to be able to take that and run with it. And different plans have different purposes. So you need to know exactly what you need before a disaster strikes or when a disaster strikes, who does what. And I think the emphasis is, let's focus on rebuilding, but when we rebuild with a focus on building back better, so you're prepared for the next disaster. It's not a band-aid. You need to look at it holistically. Do not just, quick and dirty solutions don't go a long way. So I would say those are the 3 things that for me are takeaways when I start looking at doing work. I feel like there's not much emphasis given to planning. Because we don't have the money to do it. If you don't have a plan in place, when something happens, I will tell you that you will not be ready. So there's got to be more emphasis on the planning side.
I would pose the same questions to Push.
Right. Thank you, sir. Yes, I think I'll start with this, that because of climate change, we need to have a complete overhaul of the way we think of a disaster. And I say that because, previously, according to me, I think that disasters was considered as like a random blip event that took place, and now we have to deal with the consequences, whether it's an earthquake or a tsunami or a cyclone. It was considered a random event. Now, that might still be true for some of the disasters like earthquakes and tsunami, but it's not true for the hydrometeorological disasters which are affected by climate change. Now it's almost expected that we are going to have that disaster. So we need to, that's why, rethink the way that we look at disasters. So that's one. And then the second would be that in order to implement that, we need to have regional level, local level risk assessment frameworks. We need to analyze the risk profile. And, I mean, I'm sure you'll agree that in South Asia, that's the first biggest challenge that we need to solve, because we simply don't know the risk profile of many of our areas. And if we don't know the risk profile, we cannot put into place the mitigation strategies. And then third and finally, the dynamic nature. I don't think I can stress this enough, that if we are expecting, because you also said that the sea level rise projection could be wrong. And if what we know now might change 10 years from now. So if we are building a breakwater, or if we are building a sea level sea wall, then the height of that seawall, we have to make sure that it's something that can be changed 10 years from now without incurring any extra cost. So that dynamic nature, I think, is very important. Thank you, sir.
Any other? Yeah, Tom, you have your hand up. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you both for excellent presentations. I wanted to follow up a little bit on what Dr. Bajaj just mentioned. For those of you who don't know me as well, I grew up in Louisiana, and I know that we have some representatives from Bangladesh where we have some similar problems with land loss and sort of slow sea level rise and things like this. You mentioned, Dr. Bajaj specifically, you mentioned in your presentation about sort of slow acting disasters. And I think that that comes a little bit into what you were just mentioning about changing the idea of what a disaster is. But I wondered if you could maybe just talk a little bit about how, and welcome thoughts from Mr. Nivasan as well, on what does it look like to prepare for something that looks so different from what we're used to in terms of a disaster? It's not a tornado, it's just a slow increase in saltwater intrusions and things like that.
Right. Yes, I think, sea level rise is the perfect example for slow moving disasters. You could also consider the rise of infectious diseases and their scope because of climate change. The pandemic is an example. But talking about sea level rise, I think the challenge in preparing for sea level rise is the timeline. Because it's a slow moving disaster, it's and the way in which our plans work and our planning process works, that's a very short term process that we only think of. The planning duration is the duration of the government, so that's around 4 years, 5 years. And so that the foresight to plan for something that might happen 20 or 30 years from now, which is a high impact but slow moving disaster, is definitely a challenge. And that's why it needs to be, the only thing that can be done is proactive planning, that you start now and prepare for something that you expect, or indeed it's a scientific fact that it's going to occur. So if you already know something, then you need to have some proactive planning. And again, the dynamic part, I would just reiterate that if you're regarding that, let me just add one more sort of an anecdote, that there is a very stark difference between the people that are observing sea level rise and the people that are modeling sea level rise. So the climate modelers that are using computer models to predict future sea level rise are saying something very different from the people that are actually standing on the Greenland ice sheet and noticing it fall apart. So that, and in the IPCC reports, you only see the climate model projections, and you don't really see a debate going on between the modelers and the observational scientists. So that communication, when you talked about how do you plan for that, I think that communication between the modelers and the observational scientists, the back and forth needs to be there so that you don't end up getting surprised by the future rate of sea level rise. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
And I would also like to add, you're from New Orleans, so you can relate to this. When you're talking about slow rising disasters, I also believe that regardless of disaster, in some places, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Case in point, Hurricane Katrina in 2006. New Orleans is located in a bowl. So it is very, very susceptible. Climate change, flooding, hurricanes, they are going to come. They're going to be fast and more furious with climate change because the land is sinking, the temperatures are rising, and the water level is rising. So it's a three-way whammy, if you will. So after that, the Army Corps of Engineers between 2008 and 2012 decided to build this levee and it was billions of dollars that went into this levee, only to be prepared for the next disaster that was definitely going to strike. We just did not know when. So here comes Hurricane Ida, and what do we see? New Orleans, the levees held up versus a lot of the other places which either did not have levees or the levees did not hold. So let us not underestimate the impact of future disasters. And I think Dr. Bajaj might have sort of hinted on this, is that what we call 100-year floods are starting to become 5-year floods and 10-year floods. It's like your chance of 1 in 100 is reduced to 1 in 5. So you've got, and that 1 in 5 can happen 5 times in 1 year. It doesn't necessarily say, it's not five once in 5 years. So it's not a question of if, and it's a question of when. So we've got to take every disaster that we've had very seriously, and then just make sure that we are prepared for the next. I mean, in cases of New Orleans, we know that it's of that magnitude, but a lot of the other communities, for example, let's just say, communities in Tornado Alley are sort of fitted with safe rooms and hardened structures. Who would think you would have a tornado in New Jersey, where a whole community was leveled out. So it's right now, it's not even location based because of global warming, climate change. It's happening everywhere. It's happening within the country, it's happening worldwide. So I think you're going to have to look at it holistically. And there's no question that climate change, right now, we integrate that into all of our hazard mitigation plans. It has to be front and center for us to be overall protected. So, just sort of anticipating disasters is sort of a good thing to begin with. And the question begins, where do we start, right?
Yeah, I wish we had an equal amount of time for discussions that we've had for the entire session this morning. So I'm not going to, I would have loved to have invited a few other participants, to give their points of view from, I see there's a Japanese participant here and there are some others with serious qualifications, but I'll abstain. Maybe you can chip in and follow up with your own experiences to NBR so that they could incorporate it. But I think the points that we came in towards the end of the session really pointed to the fact that we all need to work together to address these mega issues. These are not issues which you can tackle piecemeal, bit by bit. These are not issues that you can fall back on reactive measures. The point you mentioned, Tom, earlier, I mean, sea level rise is contributed not just by the melting of the Arctic ice and the glacials and other things. It's also contributed by the rise of global temperature. Now, since the anticipated rise of global temperature is going to be higher than what was anticipated, rest assured that most of it will be absorbed by the oceanic waters, which will swell the waters. So it's not just the actual content being added, it is just the volume being expanded by the heat. And third, there's a lack of forestation, which was naturally existing along the Sundarbans, the mangrove forests. A lot of them have disappeared. I would say perhaps there has been a 60% depreciation in the total mangrove coverage in the last 100 years. They are an invaluable carbon sequestration zinc, as well as an invaluable atmosphere reoxygenation plant. So if they disappear, there's a double whammy for us. We will not, there will be no sinks to absorb the excessive carbon dioxide and none to add back oxygen. Basically we come down to the fundamental question, how do we manage with there is a crude saying in Bangla that if a person has only a lungi to cover himself, a lungi is a sarong, it covers half the body, and you pull it up, his lower half is naked. If you pull it down, the upper half is naked. That's the challenge that we are facing with. How do we use it to get the maximum protection for our peoples without sacrificing a lot of things that we, essentially need? So governance issues at the center, bottom, and top of everything over here. Unless we can resolve that, we will just continue having seminars like this in the future, coming back with updating the disasters that have overtaken the previous figures, etc. So with those, I will close my remarks and hand over to Tom for his final comments.
So much, Ambassador Karim, for those capstone points, and thank you again to both of our excellent panelists. As Ambassador Karim mentioned, we have limited time, and we're very excited to see all of our participants participate in our event. And I would just say, if you have any questions for our panelists or for our moderator, we will be moving into breakout sessions following the next panel, where we'll have about 20 or 25 minutes for more of that person-to-person contact, so that if you have follow-ups with either of them, you can do so then. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes here to refresh your beverage of choice, depending on the hour of the day in which we find ourselves. And We're going to reconvene in just a couple of minutes for our last panel on disaster preparation, headed by Nalanthi Samaraniake. So we'll reconvene in just a few moments. Thanks, everyone.
From Seattle.
Hello, Nalanthi. Thank you so much for getting up early. I know that Deepa is also on the West Coast, so you two have gone above and beyond the call of duty.
Feel like an NBR's headquarters is in Seattle. It must mean something.
Yeah, yeah. It's the connection. I do often have to explain when I'm introducing our organization. It throws into stark contrast the confusion between the state and the district here. So
Yes, so true.
my mother thought I was moving for a few months when I got this job. She was like, "So you're going to Washington?" I was like, "No, Mom." Staying on the East Coast.
Sure.
Oh, I feel like I should also, for the record, just for the official record, that I am not actually from New Orleans. I'm from not very far from New Orleans, but the New Orleans Cultural Police will get mad at me if that's entered into the official record.
Oh, funny.
No, I was listening to NPR this morning and I noticed, this is what they are talking about, right? Is hurricanes and unexpected tornadoes in New Jersey, and disaster relief for wildfires in California. So it's all very current and definitely very relevant. So as we're warming back up, thanks everyone for sticking with us. I know that we're reaching the end of an exciting program, and I believe that we'll have an exciting final panel for all of you. So as we move into the final stage of how we're organizing this discussion, we're going to be looking at some of the disaster preparation, some of those longer term questions. And I'm very excited to introduce today's moderator, Ms. Nalanthi Samaraniake, who works for CNA and whose career spans many regions and many subject areas, and where she also works extensively on non-traditional security threats, as well as traditional security threats. And her bio is available in the agenda materials. So Nalanthi, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Tom. It's wonderful to join this very interesting conference. We heard about disaster mitigation earlier, and now over the next hour, we'll move on to the phase of disaster preparation and building resilience in the long term. We'll examine the intersection of geopolitics and cooperation on disaster preparation. In South Asia, we cannot avoid the factor of geopolitics. That is clear in the decades of history in the region. Yet cooperation is vital, given the scope and the scale of threats and the fact that disasters do not know national boundaries. We'll also explore facilitators of cooperation at the subnational level, as well as the role of NGOs, among other topics. I am delighted to introduce this powerhouse panel of experts. You have their detailed bios in front of you, and we'll first hear opening remarks from Akriti Vasudeva, who is a research analyst with the South Asia program at the Stimson Center in Washington. She's also the editor-at-large at the must-read online magazine, South Asian Voices. Akriti, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nilati, and thank you, Tom and NBR, for inviting me. First of all, good morning, good evening to everyone. I've really enjoyed being a part of this project, really enjoyed the discussions in the working groups. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there for yesterday's session, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation today and learning from all of you. I was on a panel with Colonel Palmar a while ago and really learned a lot from his experience. So want to hear, thoughts that you have on what I'm going to present today. So my research actually focuses on deterrence and conflict dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. So today what I'll try to do is use a geopolitical lens to look at the role that India and the Quad can play in potential disaster preparedness in the South Asian region. So, since I don't have too much time, I'll only kind of focus on two questions, which is, what is the role that India can play? What is it already and what it can do in the future? And what is the role that the Quad has played or can play? So, India is the largest country in the region and has military and economic capabilities that outpace those of other countries. So what responsibilities has it taken so far, and how does it envision its future role in sort of disaster management broadly, but disaster preparedness specifically in the region? I think the point I wanted to make is that India has, over the last few years, stepped up its commitment to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief because it sees this aspect as a demonstration of its growing regional and global leadership role. And we've seen this, at the highest political levels, such as through Prime Minister Modi and his endorsement of the idea of security and growth for all in the region. Monikar Sagar, or what he's termed as India using its capabilities for the benefit of the common maritime home of the Indian Ocean region. And this is also apparent through, the Indian Navy's 2015 Maritime Security Strategy, which looks at HADR as a way of reinforcing India's net security provider credentials and playing up its benign role in, achieving the objectives of soft power projection. So I think this sort of idea and this political emphasis and military emphasis has led New Delhi to contribute to disaster management efforts outside of its borders. So in terms of response, the two biggest examples, of course, are first, India's role in the multilateral effort to deal with the Indian Ocean tsunami in Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and the Maldives. The second is, of course, the Indian assistance during the 2015 Nepal earthquake, but India's also, done operations and taken up evacuations in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and other countries in the region. And I think broadly, Indian responsibility towards, disasters, as Ambassador Karim was saying, also involving COVID, this was most recently seen in India's response to the coronavirus pandemic, as part of which it actually conducted diplomacy and provided medical supplies and vaccines and assistance to Maldives, Sri Lanka, Seychelles, Mauritius, and Nepal, among other countries. Besides, also, if you look at the kind of SARC items, it proposed the COVID emergency fund and also proposed information sharing between countries in the region on the dealing with the coronavirus pandemic under the SARC organization. So I think this indicates that India is trying to position itself as a provider of public goods in the region in order to gain goodwill and to be a responsible stakeholder and undertake, the burden of responsibilities in the region, particularly because it aspires to be a regional and potentially, global leader. And I think since we are talking about the intersection of geopolitics and disasters in general, which is, what I focus on. I think this is especially relevant because India is battling with China to have good standing in the region, because China is increasing its forays into South Asia and has a lot of influence in countries like Nepal and Maldives initially, Sri Lanka. And I think it may find it difficult to compete in offering huge investments in economic development projects because of the resource constraints that it has, but it sees providing support with regard to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief as being very much within its wheelhouse and its capabilities. So we've seen the role, that India has played already in the region in terms of providing a valuable service on sharing data on maritime incidents and natural disaster alerts through the Information Fusion Center. And this is, based on various inputs from the coastal radar networks, white shipping agreements with countries, from port authorities, etc. And this helps countries in the region who sign up for these alerts in the Indian Ocean region. It provides a common maritime picture of the region for everyone, especially considering preparing for disasters. And the other thing that I think India has emphasized as well is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which was launched in 2019 and has members such as Australia, France, Japan, and the US. And it's essentially meant as a forum for sharing best practices and technical expertise related to developing standards for resilient infrastructure, and also collaborating for research projects that address specific needs related to infrastructure. So I think India has the capacity and the will to collaborate with countries in the region and support efforts towards joint disaster preparedness. But what are limitations and what are considerations that we have to make, and how can these be mitigated? So I think that the big issue that Nilanti was talking about at the top of this session was India's kind of image as a big brother of sorts in the region. Its experience potentially of seeking to be involved or influence policies of other countries in the region to its benefit. It could potentially hamper collaborative efforts related to disaster preparedness. But I think that a frank and candid discussion with countries in the region that focuses on sensitivities, whether it's done in a bilateral or multilateral or minilateral setting, can help dispel some of these concerns, especially if you stress the shared nature of these disasters. And I think the other point I want to make is also that what can help potentially is involving other countries in the region that have less of a historical baggage, such as the Quad. So, what role can the Quad play in disaster preparedness in South Asia? Now, I think first question is, why should the Quad even be involved in HADR and in the region? I think the Quad, where for those who don't know, is essentially a consultative mechanism that comprises India, US, Japan, and Australia to look at sort of common challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. That grouping itself has disaster relief beginnings. It came about as an ad hoc grouping that was coordinating responses to the Indian Ocean tsunami in December 2004. And even at that time, US officials had build it as a grouping that could provide public goods to the region, that could shoulder some of the responsibilities of ensuring security and stability in the region. And each of these countries, Japan, US, India, Australia, they have comparative advantages and assets that they can bring to bear in helping countries in the Indo-Pacific region deal with the impact of natural disasters, or to prepare for natural disasters. And I think recently, especially, you've seen much more of this commitment. If you look at kind of the agenda of the Quad Leaders Summit, and the Quad leaders have said that they want to have a positive and concrete agenda to help the region deal with challenges in the region. An example of this in the context of the coronavirus pandemic is the Quad Vaccine Initiative, in which these countries are pooling their resources and expertise to develop vaccines to provide to countries in Southeast Asia. So, and previously also we've seen that Quad countries have actually held bilateral and multilateral exercises that are focused on disaster scenarios and search and rescue operations. So they are looking at finding ways to collaborate and be interoperable to prepare to respond to a calamity in the region. But what can be the future role of the Quad, and what are the potential challenges that it might face as it goes about doing that. I think that it is definitely valuable to look at the Quad as a potential capacity building mechanism. I think the Quad can actually put in place building blocks for an interoperable environment in the region. Okay, I need to wrap up soon. So I think that the point I wanted to make regarding the Quad is that these countries can actually come together and look at working on disaster management technology that they could provide, to countries in the region to deal with sort of streamlining the information that comes in during a disaster, crisis, or ways to intelligently interpret data, or they can also provide drills or tabletop exercises that involve the embassy staff in these countries and look at ways that they could respond to a potential disaster. And just one point I wanted to make, Talanti, if you would allow me, is that we always look at geopolitics as a potential limitation or hurdle in disaster preparedness or disaster management in general. And I think the point I wanted to stress is, sure, the Quad has a perception of being a mechanism that's aimed to counter China, and that could make countries wary of not wanting to choose between the US and China, and thus refusing Quad assistance. But I think it can also be an advantage if you frame disaster relief as a reputational benefit for donor countries or countries that are assisting, or market it as sort of a harbinger of regional leadership. It can actually help focus attention and resources on this issue that otherwise wouldn't be there. Let me stop there and thank you, Lanti.
Wonderful. Thank you, Akriti, for your opening remarks. We definitely look forward to following up on some of the points you made in our discussion. But next, we will hear from Professor Takako Izumi of Tohoku University in Japan, where she serves in the Office of the President, working on the promotion of international disaster science and the International Research Institute of Disaster Science. And she also serves as program director for Tohoku University's multi-hazard program. Of note for our panel, she worked closely on the 2005 Indian Ocean tsunami recovery with the UN. Professor Izumi, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nilanti, and also good morning and good evening to all. And my name is Takako Izumi from the International Research Institute of Disaster Science in Tohoku University in Japan. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to share some of the preparedness activities we are doing here in Sendai. So Sendai City was struck very badly in the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011. So since then, it has been already 10 years, but still the reconstruction and recovery work is still ongoing. And today, I would like to make a couple of points based on our experiences of preparedness activities after the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. So first of all, my research institute is called Irreversible. It was established in 2012. It's next year of that Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, to strengthen the research capacity, especially on the interdisciplinary research. So we thought, and from based on the experiences of disaster in 2011, we thought only science or engineering cannot solve everything, but rather we thought we should strengthen further the aspect of social science and also the humanity and history. So there are so many things we can learn from those areas as well. So we try to combine from the different side of the researches into one in a very unique efforts on the ground. And so we have 5 or 6 divisions in our research institute. It's called the Disaster Humanity and Social Science Division and Disaster Medical Science. So we have quite a lot of doctors as well in our research institute to study about disaster medicine as well. And practical research on collaboration division and risk evaluation division, etc. So we are trying to collaborate, of course, with a lot of different stakeholders from the government and international organizations, NGOs, and private sector, and also the communities as well. So, of course, as you know, the national government usually has the biggest responsibility for disaster management or response, recovery, and disaster risk reduction. But I believe the role of the local stakeholders are huge. For example, local governments and also the civil society organizations and definitely the communities themselves. So we usually use the term self-help and mutual help and also public help. So these three helps are very, very important in disaster, in different stage of the disaster management. But self-help is quite important. That's what we learned from the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, as well as mutual help as well. Then, today I'd like to introduce some of the cases done by local government here in Sendai. So the city is called Tagajo City, and that was also badly hit by Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. And what they have decided is that local government made some 8 strategies, DR strategies, which is quite unique for local governments. They really emphasized, the DR activities. So there are 8 activities, but rather they put 4 major pillars, namely development disaster resilient city, and increasing DR capacity based on self and mutual help, then sharing disaster experience, and enhancing DR technology. These are the 4 the pillars of their activities mainly. So under developing disaster resilience, what they have done, their details, is that first one is building multiple barriers of tsunami. That's it's called multiple defense at the same time. And of course, we built quite long seawalls on the seacoast. On the seacoast after the disaster. So that was more like a national government strategy, and they, told the local government to build those seawall. And there are so many, the discussions on the and the people residents, and some city says they want to have the seawall, but some said they don't want. So there are so many discussions, but this city decided to have seawall, but they thought seawall itself is not enough. So behind the seawall, they put some green barrier. They put a lot of trees. Then after that, they put emergency, elevated highway. Then they put more evacuation. It's called the evacuation road. Then they put the more like factories. Then they put much harder. The higher places, the resident places. So that kind of multiple layers there. That was one of the it's a sort of a mitigation strategy. Then they did developing earthquake resilient city. For that, they made most of the buildings, especially the schools, and with the anti-seismic structures, so that most of the more than 90% or 95% of the public school has anti-seismic structures already. And also, not only the tsunami and earthquake, they put flood damage. For the floods. And they put rainwater draining system, and also the rainwater draining pump as well. So this kind of, there's so many activities they started after the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, and at the same time, they did a lot of public awareness activities. They developed the guideline. It's a small, small guidebook, and they distribute it to the schools and also the communities. And not only given that kind of guidelines and guidebook, but rather they had small sessions and always the meetings together with the communities, the people, and also the schools. They did some classes and lectures and to the children about tsunami and also how they can protect themselves at the time of the crisis. So like this, the local governments made a lot of efforts to protect their citizens by themselves. So not only this city, but rather there are so many local cities who started DR activities right after the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. And another major activities or major initiatives started after the disaster is that the government started to build a lot of memorial buildings. It's like parks and also the museums and monuments. It's just we just did not want to forget that what happened. So, after 10 years, 20 years, we will forget what happened. But we thought it's we shouldn't forget it. So that we built the museums and parks, but mostly we used the damaged elementary school buildings, for example. Of course, it's damaged by tsunami, so that we cannot use it for schools anymore. So in that case, we turned this building into the museum. So it's quite popular because a lot of students and visit there and can learn what happened. And also we put a lot of exhibits. Then we put some videos, and they can see what happened from the audio visual things, and they can feel some the earthquake shaking. So that kind of facilities we established a lot from the after that disaster. And actually it's a lot. I was very impressed the last 10 years. I don't know how many those kind of facilities they built, and a lot of people and students visited there to learn what happened. And we just don't want to forget that kind of experience. Then, and one of the also that the story from that affected site, it's called the miracle of Kamaisi City. So Kamaisi City is one of the worst hit city by this disaster. More than 1,000 people died in the city, and totally this by this tsunami, more than 20,000 people died. But in Kamaisi City, more than 1,000 people died. But fortunately, they had 3,000 school children, and there's no one who died, from the school children, which was really lucky. So that we call it a miracle of Kamaisi City. So the reason why they did not lost any, the lives of children is that they repeatedly did some evacuation drills very regularly, so that at the time of tsunami, students actually knew how they have to act. So that, of course, they knew they have to evacuate, but they knew also where to evacuate. Some of the students said, okay, we were in the second floor. Okay, so that probably the third floor, or if we go evacuate third floor, it should be okay. But some of the students said that's not enough, because this kind of earthquake, like magnitude of 9.0, and they heard probably higher than 3 meter tsunami is coming. And that was the first announcement. But they thought, well, with the earthquake weight of 9.0, that tsunami cannot be only 3 meters. It's going to be much, much higher. So that they thought, okay, we should not stay here, but rather we should evacuate into the higher places. So that they started running, and of course everyone started evacuating to the higher places. Then, and at some point, they met, and junior high school students met the junior high school students, so that the senior students took the junior students, and together they also run into that higher places. So, that kind of knowledge helped, and also saved a lot of lives of students. And of course, the teachers and the people, probably the firefighters, they of course helped and guided them how to evacuate. But, that's the decision usually come from the students. So and why they have that kind of knowledge is that because regularly they did that kind of evacuation drill, so that they knew how to do it. So that is called the miracle of Kamaisi. But on the other hand, there are some places in elementary school who lost nearly the 100 the students' lives. So that's quite the opposite side. And at that time, I'm not going to tell that kind of story anymore. I mean, it becomes quite long. But at the time, unfortunately, the students did not evacuate. They did not take any evacuation action. So that unfortunately they washed away in the middle of the the evacuation. So that was simply too late. So that kind of decision is very, very important. And where those decisions come is just experience and knowledge and education, we thought.
Professor,
Yes.
could you wrap up right now, and we can return to some of your points?
Yeah. So I finished that. So yeah, the last point I just wanted to make is that also the importance in the role of the private sector is also important. And what we are really, the promoting and guiding to the private sector is that to have the business continuity plan, at least, so that our institute is also helping a lot of small, medium, and enterprises to develop the BCP plans as well. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor, for your points. I was very interested to hear your mention of the seawall that was established along the coastline. It made me think about Japan's vital assistance to Maldives in building their own seawall around their capital in Male. The fact that Japan is also an international provider of this type of disaster resilience activities. So we'll hope to pick up some more on your points during our discussion. But finally, we'll hear from Sohini Bose, who is a fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in Kolkata. Of note for our panel, she is currently working on the Bay of Bengal and is studying the BIMSTEC Regional Cooperative Organization. Sohini, over to you.
Hi, thank you. I hope I'm audible. Yeah. So good morning, good evening, wherever you are right now. And today I have been asked to talk about BIMSTEC. Why is BIMSTEC important? Because if you're talking about disaster management in South Asia, especially from the lens of regional cooperation, it is important to have a look at the Bay of Bengal, which can be considered the epicenter of the world hazard belt, which often is the Indian Ocean is referred to as. And BIMSTEC, as the regional or sub-regional organization, which is exclusive to the Bay, is almost a mirror reflecting the attitudes of its member states towards disaster management. And now I will just delve into the story of how this organization has approached disaster management, which will give us an insight into the attitude of the countries in this region towards this transnational threat. Now, why is it important to have regional cooperation in disaster management in this region? It's because Bay of Bengal gives rise to very frequent cyclones and intermittent tsunamis, which arise because of its proximity to the Andaman-Sumatra subduction zone, and it generates a huge amount of loss of lives, and it dilapidates infrastructure, it takes a toll on the livelihood. But despite it being such a significant non-traditional security threat in the Bay of Bengal, it is only last year that BIMSTEC, in its 24 years of existence, has conducted the second disaster management exercise. So this is surprising. One would say that why would a regional organization which is exclusive to the Bay of Bengal, which is so infamous for its natural disasters, why did it carry out its only second disaster management exercise in 24 years? So this is what we are going to explore today. Now, as I see it, in the 24 years of BIMSTEC's existence, at least in its attitude towards disaster management, can be categorized into 4 phases. The first phase is from 1997 to 2004. And now 1997 is the year in which BIMSTEC was established, and essentially, it was not an organization which was, devoted towards dealing of this transnational disaster threat. What was it essentially? It was essentially an organization for economic and technical cooperation. So naturally, it did not have much to do with disaster management. They had it in their minds as some kind of a future goal. So naturally, there was this level of inertia about the, how to deal with disasters within BIMSTEC. And also we have to keep in mind is that countries in this region, they're very used to experiencing average amount of cyclones every year. So until something very overwhelming happens, it is very difficult for the countries to take notice and gather together and take some initiative to, kind of mitigate that kind of threat. And that is exactly what happened in 2004. In 2004, we have the Indian Ocean tsunami, which overwhelms the region and all the countries in this region. And in doing so, it breaks this spell of inertia. It makes the countries realize that they are significantly overlooking a national threat which can compromise all their attempts at building prosperity in this region, engaging in economic cooperation, technological cooperation, whatever. So this ends the passive phase of BIMSTEC 1997 to 2004. Now 2005 to 2006. These 2 years, BIMSTEC experiences a rare vibrancy, these 2 years. Why? Because the memories of the tsunami are very fresh. The countries realize they have to do something to get over this, and they have to do something to mitigate this disaster. So they create this area of cooperation on environment and disaster management. It is added to the list of BIMSTEC's to-do lists. And India offers to chair it. Nobody opposes because India has the largest prowess in the region to provide HADR. And then BIMSTEC organizes workshops. It is realized that regional collaboration is necessary. Countries share best practices. They talk about early warning, disaster response, and everything. And they also talk about establishing a Center for Weather and Climate Change. But this vibrancy does not last. Why does it not last? And I'll be taking cues from Ambassador Tariq Karim's statements throughout, because what he said is very important for my presentation today. And why does this vibrancy not last? It is because, firstly, the countries do not have a substantial economic commitment towards BIMSTEC. That is one thing for which this continuous commitment does not manifested as the memories of the tsunami begin to fade. Secondly, there are other urgent commitments which come up for the countries, right? And also there are no urgent, more new initiatives that are being undertaken. So from 2007 to 2014, we see that BIMSTEC once again recedes into the dormancy. BIMSTEC is occupied with more institutional challenges. It needs to build a secretariat. It needs to, have a new chair. So these are the thoughts which occupy BIMSTEC, and disaster management naturally recedes once again into the background. So what happens in 2015? Why should we end this phase as 2014, and why does a new phase begin in 2015? It is because in 2015 something happens across the region which brings the attention of all these countries back to the Bay of Bengal, and through the manifestation of political will, this organization rejuvenates once again, and BIMSTEC, the area of environment and disaster management, emerges not as an area for enhancing disaster mitigation, but as an area for confidence building amongst countries in this region, right? Why? Because several things happen. Firstly, India is the lead of this segment. So what happens within India that India decides to rejuvenate the sector? First thing, that there is a change of government. The Modi government comes to place. And what is the Modi government's priority? It wants to highlight India's foreign policy. And in India's foreign policy, what does it seek to highlight? It wants to engage in countries on issues which are, common threats in the region. Natural disasters naturally emerge as one of them. Therefore, we see this reflection in several things. The National Maritime Strategy comes out in 2015, the National Disaster Management Plans are formulated in 2016. In all this, there is an avid articulation of India's interest to engage in this region with other countries, to not only engage in disaster response, as it has been for so long, but engage in disaster preparedness for the first time. What happens in its bilateral collaboration? Obviously, it wants to engage. So does this have many manifestations in the relations with the countries? Yes, it does. India's Act East policy takes place, where India wants to engage in areas of non-traditional security threats. It wants to engage with the countries. So that is one area it wants to collaborate in. Secondly, its opinion of the SAARC goes downhill. So all its attention is now focused on BIMSTEC, which does not have too many internal disputes which can hinder its progress, right? So that is another thing which happens within BIMSTEC. And the third change that happens is that, Bay of Bengal with its has a huge repository of hydrocarbon resources, and very many sea lanes of communication. And the assertive rise of China makes countries conscious of their presence in the region and the need to preserve the autonomy or freedom of navigation in this region. So they want to come together, engage in regional collaboration, because that is a way of enhancing their presence in this maritime space where they may lose the freedom of navigation. So regional collaboration in disaster management, it is a humanitarian concern. So it is a non-traditional security threat, but it does offer the opportunity of collaboration and confidence building amongst countries. So this is the political will which brings together the region once again, and the countries decide to cooperate in disaster management. And since then, several initiatives have been taken, most prominently the disaster management exercises of BIMSTEC 2017, 2020. But what is the future of this organization right now? And the future, as I see it, it has several challenges still. Particularly if you talk about the sector on disaster management, I will say that the organization is very nascent as yet. It does not, it has a significant lack of maturity, because if no concrete efforts were made in its past, it is only presently that efforts are being made to enhance this section substantially. Secondly, regional collaboration in disaster management will be very narrow if the institution is not granted substantial autonomy or discretion, and therefore it remains confined to response exercises and overall preparedness of exchange of best practices in the region. It mostly does not venture into efforts of recovery or reconstruction, because those lie significantly within the national jurisdictions, right? Thirdly, BIMSTEC suffers from the absence of long-term plans for disaster management. Of course, BIMSTEC lacks a charter in itself, and the charter is now, talks are now on within BIMSTEC to create this charter, and with it outlining the long-term visions and the policies of the government. But till date, the charter is yet to be finalized, and so the blueprint of actions is not there for this institution. Thirdly, very important, let me come to the institutional constraints. BIMSTEC lacks from a consolidated fund. It operates on a very lean budget, and it leaves very little for funding cooperative efforts. Now, let me tell you this, that there is talks of developing a BIMSTEC development fund with voluntary contributions from member states for planning and financing of BIMSTEC projects. It is likely to allow member countries to focus and invest in their specific pet projects, and therefore it will override the consensus clause and allow for more multi-speed organization. And so this is something which is something to be looked forward to. Also, the Secretariat of BIMSTEC, which is the main institutional body of it, suffers from significant lack of, it is very understaffed. It needs more autonomy, and it needs more resources. So as long as the institution of BIMSTEC remains weak, the countries will not be encouraged to invest in it as much as it is needed to. And also, in recent times about the COVID pandemic, every other regional organization in South Asia, so you name it SARC, you name it IORA, or you name ASEAN in Southeast Asia, they have cooperated in COVID pandemic in some way or the other. It is only BIMSTEC that no initiatives have undertaken. So questions are really being raised how far BIMSTEC will be able to carry forward its ambition of building regional collaboration in the region and very many aspects. So these are some of the challenges which are facing BIMSTEC. Do I have 2 more minutes?
No, your time's up now.
Okay, then we will talk on this later.
Great. Thanks so much, Sohini. I know there's a lot of information here that we can get into, and all 3 panelists have just had excellent presentations. We've only got, we'll have just a quick Q&A with us, so attendees can also have time to ask their questions. I'd like to go back to you, Akriti, to your panel. You raised a very interesting point about within South Asia, the dynamic of perceptions of India being a big brother. There's also the dynamic of geopolitics with China. We saw after the Doklam incident in 2017, the cutoff of data sharing between China and India, which is critical to avert the floods and the deaths, the fatalities that have resulted previously due to these floods on the Brahmaputra. Can you talk about how can countries navigate this within region dynamic of India being seen as the big brother, but also externally with China and the geopolitics there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the million-dollar question, I think. It's how do you build tactical cooperation that helps you deal with shared challenges while still trying to kind of manage the threats that you face in sort of the strategic and insecurity domains. I think in the context of countries in South Asia and India's role, what I think a lot about and what would help kind of dispel some of the geopolitical concerns related to India wanting to use its role in these disaster efforts as leverage or for potential reputational benefits that are specific to India could be maybe, which is why I said doing things with the Quad, which is hopefully more seen more as sort of a multilateral effort and not focused on India's history with these countries, but also is there a way to not center the military in leading the response or not being kind of the face of the response or preparedness efforts in the region? Is there a way that you can involve civil society members or NGOs to be trained to be sort of the ones who are doing being involved in these efforts of disaster preparedness? But in relation to kind of India and China's competitive dynamics and how that plays out with other countries in the region and not wanting to kind of be involved, I think that's really hard to do. It's very, very hard to build tactical cooperation, like I was saying, and not get involved in this sort of choosing between India and China in these efforts. I do think that it's actually possible to have dialogue on these issues despite having sort of strategic issues and competitive dynamics. And we've seen that even with, for example, India and China, right after Doklam happened, they actually did work together on training diplomats in Afghanistan. So they have taken up certain projects of working together in third countries despite having this sort of history of competition. So I think if you can have sort of more of a candid and frank discussion, like I was saying, about particular sensitivities that countries have in the region with regard to sovereignty, with regard to how they don't want to get caught between India and China, then you could potentially have some shared projects that can work, but just being careful not to bring them into sort of the competitive element of the region.
Great. Thank you, Akriti. Excuse me. Looks like we already have a question from an attendee. Captain Sarabjit, could you ask your question?
Actually, it's more of a comment than a question. So let me attempt to convince you to use the word preferred security partner instead of big brother in the region or something, and that's how we would like to play it. Because not only have we given help during HADR or the present COVID, but we have also received aid from the nations in the region. So that's one point I'd like to press forward, if you would like to change the term to a preferred security partner. Insofar as talking to China is concerned, now that's a long road and there is presently a barrier existing. But coming back to the aspect of sharing information insofar as, say, disaster management is concerned, there's a report I read recently. I tried tracing it in the labyrinth of information we store on our hard drives, where China has built so many dams and power generating centers which are now languishing. And as a result, a lot of rivers have apparently dried up within China. So if you expect China to actually share on-ground actual information, I think you're not going to get it. They will not come forward. So if there is, now India is stuck as a lower riparian as far as China is concerned, upper as far as Bangladesh is concerned. So anything that happens on the rivers that feed into India and thereafter into Bangladesh. So that's one aspect. So if you're expecting honest data sharing information, you're not going to get it. So would you rather just go by certain reports or the inputs that are available, or go by what the authorities say? So that's something we'll have to look at that is the fact on ground. So I just thought I'll just pitch in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. That's an important point about terminology and phrases essentially to characterize the role where India would like to go. I think from a U.S. perspective, you hear U.S. policymakers talk about wanting the U.S. to be seen as the partner of choice. So that's interesting to hear, right, for India to be the preferred security partner. There's definitely aspirations in terms of the use of particular phrases and to characterize the right, desired perceptions of regional roles. So if others have questions, please raise your hands. In the meantime, we'll go back to the panelists. Professor Azumi, it was useful to hear your framework about the three helps and really the long-term impacts of some of these trainings where there's just certain knowledge and lessons that have been passed down in terms of just some basic evacuation procedures. To me, it almost suggested it's like you said, it is easy to forget some of these events or what the catalysts have been, but it's almost the goal in a way to forget, because there has been success and these lessons have been internalized, and you essentially have resilience where you don't have the fatalities that you once have. So it's almost it's kind of a paradox in a way about you want the end goal to be where you don't have to talk about these things. Can you comment on what you think what still needs to be done? Because you've spoken to some successes, but what are still some actionable items for the next year or 5 years to focus on?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the question. To be honest, in Japan, we have quite a lot of preparedness capacity, like infrastructure, from the experience from the last a lot of disaster histories. So even in 2011 when tsunami happened, and we never thought and expected the damage can be that large and severe. So we never expected if we are hit by tsunami or whatever other disasters, the damage cannot be that high or large. So it's simply because we thought we have quite a good infrastructure and seawall, and also we know how to how to act and how to evacuate, where to evacuate. So we thought we have done whatever we could already. But the thing is, all the damage and the intensity of the tsunami was much higher than we expected. So we already have the hazard mapping, good hazard map, so that we knew where to evacuate. But the thing is that unfortunately, the people who evacuated to the designated evacuation center also washed away. And people believed in the science and hazard map, but the reality is it's beyond our the knowledge. So since then we thought, okay, we shouldn't trust 100% science. Science is good. We definitely need information and that kind of early warning, and we need that kind of data and information. But at the end of the day, the one who have to decide is ourselves. So that we thought we should strengthen rather education, knowledge, to take the necessary measure by ourselves. So you're right, and it's very interesting comments, and everything is ready, and we shouldn't remember what happened, and because we know how to act. But I think that was the point in 2011. But the nature, we don't know what it is. We shouldn't underestimate that. So that in the future we might have much larger disaster. And in fact, we have that kind of already the prediction. In 20 years, we will have much bigger earthquake and tsunami in the wider region. And at that time, estimated death is that it's much bigger, in the 10 times of the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. So we are doing a lot of preparedness still. So it's never ends, and I think we still continue to scale up and based on better science and also our knowledge, I think.
Great. Thank you, Professor, for pointing out that it is, no matter how much advances we've made, the disasters and the threats can only continue to get worse and continue to require mitigation and extensive preparation ahead of time. All right. Oh, in our last few minutes, I wanted to get to you, Sohini, and then take one question from attendees. Sohini, it was interesting to hear how you talked about India's desire for greater leadership on disaster management. We heard a similar theme in Akriti's presentation, and it was very useful to hear the timeline of BIMSTEC's evolution and India's leadership in this regional institution, especially when we're thinking about the Bay of Bengal. That's we're thinking at the international level, the regional level. I wonder, can you take it down a bit in terms of looking at levels of subnational level within these Bay of Bengal countries, states, cities, communities? What are your observations about what some of these actors are doing at those levels? And are you seeing any patterns across BIMSTEC members in the Bay of Bengal with regard to disaster preparation efforts?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. As regards, preparation across members of BIMSTEC, let me tell you that India definitely is far advanced in amongst the others because it has already got it is already the largest HADR provider in the region, so it has substantial capabilities which it is still building. And in this respect, particularly important to note is the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. India is trying to develop these islands as a base for first response in disaster management. So the advantage is that these islands are very close to Southeast Asian countries, so compared to the Indian mainland, so it gives the advantage of saving time in an emergency, right? So this is one thing that is very important as far as India is concerned. Bangladesh is definitely making efforts to increase its disaster preparedness, but it in fact, it was one of the first countries to take up the procedures for developing community-based disaster management, particularly because while the other countries, the realization came after the tsunami. For Bangladesh, it came after Cyclone Bhola in the 1970s. So it was since then that the country has been trying to make progress, and it is presently chairing the BIMSTEC sector on climate change. So India and Bangladesh will have to work together to make long-term facilities for disaster management in the region. Bangladesh does continue to rely substantially on bilateral support in terms of disaster response, but if it is to be questioned if the country is making initiative, which members are making initiatives, Bangladesh will be recorded as one of them, definitely. Myanmar, of course, internal problems are too much in there to concentrate on other aspects of collaboration building and everything. Sri Lanka has some potential capacity in disaster preparedness, but again, the reliance is on bilateral cooperation. Thailand, the attitude, Thailand is better off compared to the other members, not India, but the other members of BIMSTEC and Thailand, but it does require bilateral support now and then. But Thailand's orientation is much more towards the ASEAN countries for disaster support in the hour of crisis rather than, looking westwards. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sohini, for your comments. And it's, yes, I think Bangladesh is also considered another success story where you've definitely seen it, at least in terms of metrics of fatalities. You've definitely seen that decline since the early 70s to the present. I know we're at time now, and I don't want us to be too late because we have the breakout sessions next. But I believe we have one person with a raised hand. I believe that's Ashley Johnson. Do you have a comment?
It was a question, and maybe we can unpack this in the breakouts as well. But thinking of Sohini's earlier comment on BIMSTEC and not having a fund and needing to get some money to help support some of these efforts, and also Azumi-san's point on the role of the private sector, and that being important, both from making sure that they have their own plans, but also thinking about how a lot of the geopolitical motivations include private sector interests sometimes as well, of how can we maybe increase foreign direct investment for benefits on both sides. But there's also that kind of driving factor. And I was wondering if the role of the private sector in some of these geopolitical efforts, either from why it might be driving some of their role, or can the private sector play a bigger role in supporting some of these efforts? I think there could be two ways that could go, but if anyone had thoughts on that, and maybe it's something that we do talk about.
Professor, do you want to take that question?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I'm not really sure I can give you the right answer, but that of course the role of the private sector is wide range. Of course, locally they can of course support the affected people in the local areas, but outside they are also the ones affected by the the other their how do you call the related companies in the outside. They are connecting the supply chain. So that was a huge problems even in the current COVID-19, also the flood. For example, the flood happened in Thailand. At the time, the damage was huge. It's global, the supply chain, that was damaged by the flood in Thailand. So in that sense, the private sector itself has to think about not really only their own region, but rather the wider scope of their network. And plus, the role of the private sector, of course, it's as I said, is huge. And for example, transportation companies like the FedEx, they have a very the strong commitment, and also they have a good agreement with the UN, the organizations to the ship and also transport and the relief goods and right away into the affected site. So that kind of contribution can be done from the private sector, and I think that would be very important for the future as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor. Thank you to all of the panelists. This was just a tremendous panel. I think we could continue talking about these topics for hours. We've only just scratched the surface, but really these have been fantastic presentations. And just to close out and hand it over to Tom, my takeaways from this were really thinking about the increasing role of India in terms of its disaster diplomacy efforts that it's been conducting for over the past 20 years, and increasingly so, also through the role of regional institutions like BIMSTEC. That's another factor in the equation that has been added. And so really looking forward to seeing the potential that could be exercised there. But then also not only at the national level and the regional level, but also at the subnational level, what are some of the roles of states and communities? We talked about the role of the private sector. That suggests a potentially under-examined area, at least by analysts who focus on strategic level issues. I think it is worthy of further examination. So I will, we're about 5 minutes over, so I will hand this over to Tom.
So much, Nilanthi. Excellent discussion from all of our wonderful panelists. And if you do have questions which you'd like to ask of the panelists, then I'm happy to submit it. We're just about to jump into some of our smaller group discussions. I'm actually going to end the recording after this, and then I'll try and get us back together in about 90 seconds. We'll see how long it takes me to wrangle with WebEx's interface and split people up. So we'll thank you all so much for your participation, and we look forward to the breakout sessions.